So last day we did an introduction to government and we covered a lot of content. So we are going to review that first. One of the things we talked about last day was the difference in the spectrum. So let's review the spectrum. On the spectrum, on the far left, we have something called a radical. If you are a radical person, you are violent and you want to create something new. You want to try to go in a new direction. So that would be a radical. The opposite of a radical would be on the right side. The extreme right would be somebody called a reactionary. A reactionary is someone like a radical that is violent, but what they disagree on is what should society look like. A radical wants society to look like something new, something that we haven't tried before. A reactionary would like to use violence to restore something we've done before. So radicals and reactionaries agree that we need a revolution, but what they disagree is what should society look like after the revolution. In fact, they are opposites. One is trying to go back in time and recreate something from the past, and the other is trying to do something new. The terms that we'll see more often in this course will be liberal and conservative. Liberal is meant to be a position on the spectrum that is leftist. And conservative is meant to be a position on the spectrum that is further to the right. And the distinction there is, how much change do you want to see in society? If you are a conservative person, do you enjoy the status quo? You don't want to see a lot of change. So you like the status quo. You like it the way it is. Conservative people, like Edmund Burke, believe that we are a part of a great chain of being. That the glory that we have today is due to the efforts of our ancestors that allowed us to be who we are. And therefore we owe a responsibility to them. So conservatives like the status quo. Like Edmund Burke, they believe that we are a part of a great chain of being. And because we're part of this great chain of being, we shouldn't alter the course too quickly. We shouldn't just one day decide, you know what, let's do things completely different than what we've been doing. We shouldn't have these sudden corrections. Whereas someone who's liberal, they're more progressive. They're more in favor of some changes. So if you have two friends, one's a liberal, one's a conservative, and you're trying to introduce something new, it's more likely that the liberal person would be in favor of that change. So 4 terms that you can see attached to government are radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. And each term is just meant to be a description of how much change should we have in society. Radicals and reactionaries want to see a lot of change, but they disagree on what direction. Liberals and conservatives also disagree on how much change. Conservatives are the ones that are most planted in the status quo. They don't want to see change. So if I can get you to look down at your notebook for a second, do you have down the terms radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary? Because if you don't have them now, probably not going to have them next Monday on the test. With conservative, do you have down the idea that they like the status quo? They like it the way it is. With reactionary, do you have it down that they want to return to the past? So, one way that you might see this next week is in a multiple choice test. You might see a sample source like we see on the board here. Viewpoint A, favors status quo, traditional, moderate to cautious. And we might ask you to identify which of those four positions is viewpoint A. Is that radical? Is that liberal, conservative, or reactionary? In that case, the answer would be conservative. Or viewpoint B says willing to change, flexible, open-minded, and that would be liberal. So one way to introduce government is to look at some of the terms associated with people as they relate to politics. And those terms are often ideologies. And we have four main ideologies: radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. So that's the first thing that we covered last week. Any question about those four things? Another thing that we covered last week was individualism and collectivism. And we talked about the different values that individualists and collectivists might have. That for individualism, we use words like private property. For collectivism, we use words like public property. Under individualism, we use words like competition. And under collectivism, we use words like cooperation. Under individualism, we use words like unique. The opposite of unique for a collectivist would be adherence to collective norms. Instead of being unique, you do what the group tells you to do. You behave and look as the group suggests that you are meant to behave and look. Individualists work for their self-interest. Collectivists work for the collective interest, the common good. So another thing that we did last week when we gathered is we looked at the difference between individualism and collectivism. Individualism and collectivism those two terms have both a political and an economic application. So not only will we see it in the first major unit of the year on politics, but we'll also see it later in the course when we look at economics. So the difference between individualism and collectivism will be a reoccurring theme in grade 9 social studies. We tried to apply some of these terms to the Canadian political map. So last week we also talked about the major political parties in Canada. And we simplified things a little bit. We said, let's look federally and only at parties that are truly federal. So the Bloc Québécois, they run, but they run in Quebec. They don't run in Alberta. I'm not going to put them on a spectrum. So we said that the most conservative party among the three major political parties is the Conservative Party. So we have the Conservative Party of Canada, Erin O'Toole's party now, to the right of center. So we should assume that of the three major parties, they would be most wanting to slow change down, to embrace the status quo, to recognize our great chain of being, and to embrace traditions. But then we also looked at the party that is most collectivist, and that's the NDP. The NDP would be the party that is most often associated with the common good, with the need for cooperation and public property. Remember, I talked about the idea of responsibility, the collective responsibility, that if there's poverty in our community, people that are collectivists, they'd like to see us intervene on behalf of those who are struggling. That it's your responsibility to be part of the solution. So the NDP would be the most collectivist party of the three that we have in Canada, because they believe that you have a responsibility to help individuals who are struggling. And then our party in the middle is our Liberal Party, that is the government federally today. So now we have multiple applications of some terms as we introduce the course, including some Canadian content. We also looked at different types of government. We looked at governments that are celebrating individualism, and we also looked at governments that may celebrate collectivism. We talked about a word called totalitarianism and authoritarianism. So last day we also saw the idea that some governments might celebrate democratic freedom, and some governments may try to restrict them. They may try to restrict them for the purpose of creating unity of purpose. They might restrict individual freedoms so that they can, through that unity of purpose, have a very ambitious foreign or domestic policy. So we talked about things that you'd see under a totalitarian last day. Things like indoctrination. So we have this government called a totalitarian. And totalitarianism, unfortunately, can be found on both ends of the political spectrum. You can have a radical totalitarian government, or you can have a reactionary one. And in the middle, we find democracy. And in chapter 1, we study democracy. But in order to understand democracy, we must understand that it's not the only political system. That there are some people that believe that democracy is flawed. And as we go over chapter 1, one of the things I want you to be considering at the back of your mind is, how can we fix Canada's political system? How can we make Canada's political system stronger? So when we talk about other types of political systems, when we talk about totalitarianism, we talked about how it could be a government chosen by birth, like a monarchy, or an aristocracy. We talked about how it could be a government where the military takes over, a military coup, military junta. We talked about how it could be a government based on ideology, like a one-party state under communism. This is all part of the introduction to the course from last day. Can I get you to look at your notes from the introduction to the course from last day? And see if you have any questions. Everything is in the lesson 1 that is a part of our digital textbook. So we have a digital textbook that has all of our lessons, and the YouTube video I'm presenting right now will be, the link will be put right there, so that when you need to go back and review this lesson, you can review the YouTube link, but you can also review the document itself. You can look at the visuals. There's some YouTube videos we watched last week about left and right and individualism and collectivism. They're embedded in that document too. We talked last day about Hobbes and Locke. We kind of left Rousseau off and said we didn't need to know him as much. We actually talked about Hobbes a lot last week, and when I made the test for next Monday, there's a lot of Hobbes content, so maybe we should go over that in a minute before we wrap this up. But again, the review is there for you. And the reason why we have this is, again, we're living at a time of pandemic. There are schools closing around the province already. We don't know when and if our school will close. We need to have a contingency plan. You may not be able to come to school tomorrow. Maybe you'll be sick. If you find yourself sick, every day we're going to be following, day by day, what is already outlined for you in our digital textbook. So what are we doing today? It's here. What are we doing on the 10th and 11th? It's there. The evaluation's there, but hopefully you can't open it. Because if you can, then that's not great. You can already see the test. So hopefully I didn't share that document with you, but my copy of it's there. So the purpose behind this is so that you don't fall behind. You missed out on the end of grade 8 last year, and the province is saying that for your long-term academic development, we can't have you have months and months of gaps in learning. So if you do have to stay home, please make sure that you are following along with us. Any questions before I get to Hobbes and Locke and wrap this up? So Hobbes and Locke, Hobbes and Locke, Hobbes and Locke, right? Remember, we try to make it nice and simple. And I truly believe that the Hobbes and Locke questions on the test next Monday can be simple. They can be easy as long as you remember these defining things about Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes believes mankind is, this is where I pause because I want you to muffle it out, but shout it out, yep. Violent. So Hobbes says man is violent, therefore government's job is to control us. If this, then what? If man is violent, government's role is to control. Hobbes says we're violent. If in a state of nature, man is at a state of war with each other. We are at war with each other in nature. If there is no government, there'd be nothing from stopping my natural, animalistic, violent behavior. It's only government that's stopping it right now. That's what Hobbes thinks. They were all so stuck on self-interest that we prey on each other. Locke, he was a little bit more optimistic about mankind. Locke believed that we are rational, and therefore the purpose of government is to protect our freedom. Hobbes says the purpose of government is to control us. Locke says the purpose of government is to make sure we are free. Those are different. That's different, right? Hobbes says mankind's bad. Man must be controlled. Therefore, maybe we get a dictatorship. Because it's only through the tyranny of a dictator that we will have life that's worth living. Whereas Locke says, no. We, the people, can be rational. Therefore, we can have democracy. Because what is democracy? It's ruled by the people. It's when we, the people, get to set the agenda of the country. What kind of direction we want our government to go. So I believe that that's all the content we covered last week, but before we wrap it up, do you have any questions? Any questions? So I'm going to go stop the video. Next up, I'm going to be getting you to do some textbook stuff. So while I'm posting this on YouTube, I'm going to get you to look at chapter 1. And in chapter 1, the first assignment you need to do is to find the 3 branches of government, and they begin on page 22. And I want you to figure out, what is it that the 3 branches do? What is the role of each branch of government? And that should take you about as much time as it'll take me to post this video, and then we will talk about the 3 branches of government and continue on with chapter 1. Thank you.